You guys have this really nice sign back there that says, 8 myths that we believe. And I think when Peter was inviting me, I don't think he did his research really well, because I actually did find the perfect church. It is not just in theory, not just up in my head. It exists as a physical object. In fact, it exists on the corner of McDaniel Street and Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard in Atlanta, Georgia. Upstairs, video people. Next slide. There we go. Now, if you look very closely at the sign that's on that church building, it says the perfect church. And I don't know about you, but I've got my plane booked. I'm leaving tonight. I'm heading over there. I'm going to learn everything this week. You guys should book your plane tickets as well, because I think we found the actual one. But the actuality comes to that's just a sign on top of a building. Does the perfect church exist? Is that myth that you have, is that one of the myths that we hold? And I think that myth, in fact, does exist. It exists in our mind, and it is something that drives us away from the church that we love, away from the church that we're surrounded by with friends and people that we know, and it drives us somewhere else. And if we think about where does this myth come from, this myth comes from a mistake, like was said. It comes from a mistake of understanding, a mistake of what we think we know, what we think we believe. And the reason, the source of this myth, or at least one of them, is the fact that we think that the early church, the church when it was founded around the time of Jesus, it was perfect. Now, we don't necessarily verbalize it, we don't necessarily say it, but we believe it in our heart, because if we were in that place, we would be in a church that was better than the one that we're in and the one that we're leaving to. It was the best church. It was the perfect example. But in fact, those churches were burdened with problems much like ours. And as some of them will go through, they're a lot worse. I mean, I haven't heard of some of the issues that they had. And the thing is that even if this was a perfect church, I can attest to you that one person in this room is at least making it not a perfect church, and that would be me. By my imperfection, the fact that I'm standing here, I would have made this church imperfect, even if it was before I walked through those doors. But that's not the case. The early church was not perfect. We're not perfect. There's not a church out there that you're going to find that's perfect. And this idea that the early church was somehow better, it kind of flies out the window. If you have your Bibles, open up to James, the book of James, and we're going to start in chapter 2. And I want to read these examples. This is James writing to some of the first churches that were founded. And he's talking to them about issues that they're having. Issues that we don't hopefully have, other issues that we definitely have, and other issues that we're in danger of having. James chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. There was an attitude of favoritism. They were partial. They liked some people. They didn't like others. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, so if you've got the Novoy Ruski coming in and you've got the bum from the street coming in, you're going to treat them differently, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes and say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit by my footstool. The early church had problems with who they liked and who they didn't like. There were in-groups, there were out-groups. There were favorites, there were those that they did not associate with. A little bit later in verse 14, chapter 2, they focused on works. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but has no works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing, in need of daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has works, is dead, being by itself. And the thing is, why mention, we're going to be going through this list, why mention these sins, why mention these errors if they don't exist? You can say, well, these are just, these are things he's listing, but these aren't things that are present. And I ask you, why are they listed here if they're not present? You don't talk about problems that aren't present. And he goes on in James 3, 5, 6, I'm not going to read, but he talks about slanderers and gossipers. He talks about in James 3 about jealousy and selfishness. He talks about people who are proud of their gifts, who were unloving, unwilling to associate with other races. There was racism even then. There's this list of problems that keeps going on and on. There were some who were getting drunk during communion. I mean, I feel bad if I take too big of a sip. They were having people who were not even sober during communion. And you say the early church is something to aspire to, and there are definitely things to aspire to there. But it was not a perfect church. There were some who were living in sexual immorality and even committing incest. For those of you who don't know, that's parents and children sleeping together. And Paul actually told one church that their meetings, their church meetings, their členské, did more harm than good. Now, I'm not a big fan of členské sometimes. But I mean, the fact that a members' meeting would do worse and that he said, you better not have them, that's a crazy place to be. And then we get to this idea, okay, if the early church was perfect, then obviously there are churches now that are perfect. And obviously we can see that the early church was not perfect. So there can't be perfect churches now. You know, when I was in Sunday school, there were some Sunday school teachers that I liked. They were fun. We got to do fun projects. They didn't ask us to turn in homework. It was great. Now, I would either like or dislike the Sunday school teacher, but I did not take that Sunday school teacher and I would expand that vision for the church to say, oh, if the Sunday school teacher is bad, then the whole church is bad. I knew how to differentiate between the two. And much like growing up, we also learned that our parents sometimes aren't exactly perfect. Sometimes they make mistakes, sometimes they say things that are obviously not correct. They made a mistake or they were trying to pull one on you. But we don't instantly say, oh, they're horrible parents. There's nothing else that they can do. As children, maybe we think that. Mom, Dad, I hate you. Parents are faulty and sinful people. The church can be faulty, can make mistakes. And that doesn't mean that we toss everything aside and we kind of lump everybody together and we say, Sunday school teachers, parents, church, all of you are bad because you are not perfect. We understand that there's some imperfection involved. And we go through this honeymoon phase, this childlike honeymoon phase, where we think as children, where we act as children, where we assume things that only children can assume. And one of those things is that church is somehow perfect. And what we do is we go to a church and we stay there for a while. And we realize, oh, this church is just like my parents. Or this church is just like my previous church. It's got problems. I'm going to jump to a different church. This one seems like it's a little bit better. And you think to yourself, wait, I'm noticing a pattern here. If I switch churches, that church seems perfect. Now, it lasts about a moon. It's a honeymoon. It lasts about a moon. Let's say it lasts a year. Let's say it lasts 5 years. Now, the secret that you learn is that, hey, if I switch between that time, between when I figure out that this church is perfect and when I figure out that it's not so perfect, I can just keep going to different churches, and every church that I visit will seem like it's perfection. Some people try to do that with relationships. They keep jumping from one to the other, and it's like, boom, loophole. I found the perfect marriage, and that's just to make sure that this one doesn't last longer than 5 years. And that's craziness. That's craziness. And we have this childlike understanding. We don't think it's childlike. We think it's wise. We think it's rational. We think it's adult-like. I have the decision. I have the choice to go where I want. That's very adult-like of me. I find something I don't like, I go in search of something better. Yet we don't realize that we deal as children with this reality that we unfortunately can't escape. And I always compare growing deeper in a relationship to two rocks coming together and grinding against one another. Whether it's a relationship with a church community, whether it's a relationship with a spouse. The fact is that there's two surfaces that interact. And much like a rock, you start off with rocks having some kind of protrusion, some kind of spikes on them. And as you rub them, those spikes, they start popping off. They're not really held together firmly. And you keep rubbing them off and they pop off. And it's like, wow, this is going really well. We're growing closer, and that's true. You grow closer with your spouse, you grow closer with your church. You know, they use King James Version. Sure, I can sprinkle some these and thous into my conversations. That's totally fine. You knock off those things. It doesn't matter what way the toilet paper roll goes on. That's fine. You want it the other way. That's totally fine. We knock off these little pieces, and we knock off more and more and more until we get to the point where we're grinding away the surface of one of the rocks or the other. And at that point, nothing's really coming off. You've got dust. You've got heat being generated. It is a complex, it is a difficult reaction. It is something that is very difficult to do. And at that point, as we're getting as close as we can possibly be, as we become molded and merged to our spouse, as we become molded and merged to our church, we decide that it is too difficult to do that anymore. It was no longer like we were bouncing off little pebbles off the surface. We're now getting to the nitty-gritty, and we say, that's it. I've had enough. This isn't perfection. This is difficulty. This is struggle. These are problems. These are problems that I don't want to deal with. And it really doesn't matter if you think it should be that way or it shouldn't be that way. That's just the way that it is. And you can either accept it as reality and say, okay, in light of that, what am I going to do? Do I keep grinding away? Do I keep getting closer and closer? Do I keep polishing these surfaces until they're practically molded and merged together? Or do I go on and start all over again? And I start breaking off the little tips in hopes that maybe this time it'll be different. And we decide to focus on things that feel a certain way instead of the way that they are, and we leave church. The more you interact with a church body, the more that you interact with sinful human beings that compose that church body, the more difficult it's going to be. And it's not just going to be about, oh, what version do you use as a Bible? It's going to be, what are your outlooks on life? What do you think the fundamental things that you believe in are going to look like? And all of a sudden we get uncomfortable in that place. We don't want to be in that place. It's an uncomfortable place to be. And conversations that initially could, be knocked off in a few minutes now require hours. Hours with the person you considered a friend, hours with the pastor that you had the highest respect for, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't know if I want to be in this place anymore. And it gets deeper and it gets harder. Because you start realizing that the church isn't perfect. And in much the same way that there's no perfect spouse, granted my wife is the greatest, there is no perfect church. And if a church looks perfect, if you come into a church and you're there for a long time and it continues to look perfect, one of two things is happening. Either the church is very good at hiding its faults, or people are very bad at admitting them. There is no third option. There are no faults. There are definitely faults. Those are the two options that you have. And one of those two is true, and neither of them is desirable. You don't want a place where people don't talk about the problems that they're having, where they don't interact with one another. And hiding problems never made them go away. And if you've been in a church for long enough, you start to realize that, hey, I've got some serious conversations. I've got some serious relationships that I need to mend, that I need to build in order for me to still feel like I'm at home in this place. And that's normal. And that's right. And some people in their quest to find a perfect church, they go from church to church and they settle down for a place for a while. Something new, something modern. The jeans are skinnier on these worship singers than my previous church, so, we can stay here for a little longer. Seems like it's a little nicer. But then the music doesn't quite fit. Maybe the sermons are too long. Maybe the sermons are about things that you don't agree with. Maybe the sermons are about things that you don't even think there should be sermons about. And stuff doesn't start to line up, and you don't like it. And some people, they say, you know what? The perfect church is the church of one. I'm going to be a free-range, cage-free, rich in omega-3s Christian. I saw the eggs in the supermarket and they looked great. I'm going to try to emulate that. I am going to be my own church of one, and that is a church of perfection. A church where everything is perfect, where I love me and nothing else can go wrong. And we stay at home and we watch TV and we say, the perfect church exists just in me. I don't want to right away, I don't want to go to this church and they're going to start weighing me down with problems. And all the churches that, all the problems that we read in James, I don't want you to look at them and say, you know, these are issues that we can ignore. Church isn't going to be perfect, so I don't want you to think that when a problem arises in a church, that your response should be, meh. No church is perfect. This one's not perfect. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about ignoring problems. I'm not talking about overlooking problems. I'm talking about putting problems in the proper perspective. That they're not deal breakers. They're something that we need to work on. There's something that we need to get better. But not to jump ship at the first sign of trouble. And there's an important reason why we have this motivation to find the perfect church. This motivation is not a bad motivation. It is something good. And why do we want a perfect church? We want a perfect church because we feel like it'll solve our problems. We want a perfect church because we feel like it'll solve our problems. Matthew 6:31. Jesus is talking to his disciples. He says, "Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat and what will we drink? Or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Don't worry about food or clothes or whether your church ranks in the top 15 growing churches, fastest growing churches in America. What is he talking about? He's talking about the kingdom first. We want the perfect church because we want to make it into our own personal idol. We want to make the church into our idol so that we're not seeking after the kingdom of God. We're seeking about something that is in line, like food, like clothes, like church. And that might seem surprising, that might seem strange. How can something that's good turn out to be bad? How can pursuing something that in essence is good turn out to be bad? And it's because we make it our idol. We dress it up and we claim that that's not why we're looking for the perfect church. But look within yourself. It's not because you're pursuing God and you're trying to be as holy as you can. It's because something is difficult and you're trying to find a place that's not difficult and you're idolizing this place. In your mind, you have the perfect church. You know exactly what kind of worship songs there are. You know exactly what kind of leaders there are. You know exactly what kind of demographic attends. You've sketched out every single curve, every single facial detail of that idol, and now you're looking for it. And you can't craft it yourself. You can't craft it out of wood. You can't craft it out of gold. So you go and you look for this idol somewhere else. And again, I don't want you to think that finding a good church is a bad thing. But searching for it with these intentions definitely is. And what happens is church becomes not a place where God has created to unify believers, to give us a sense of family, to give us a sense of home. Church becomes a place where we try to find meaning itself. Not in the reason why we come to church, but in church itself. In the groups of people that we can interact with at church, with who we can say hi to during the meet and greet, with what activities are available. And church becomes the reason, the meaning for our faith, the reason, the meaning for attending Sunday services. It's no longer God, it's no longer His kingdom. And every good thing can become a bad thing if it takes the place of God. If we put it in the place where we say, instead of God being the Most High, this thing is the Most High. And it's easy to recognize with things like food. Okay, you put food in the place of God, that's gluttony. You put desire and relationship in the place of God, that's lust. You put money and pride and all of those things, that is a completely different sin. We understand all of those things. But what happens when we put the perfect, the ideal church in the place of God? Why do we treat that as though it is not something that is an idol for us? And the thing is that even if you find such a church, even if you manage through all of your searching, through all of your idolizing to find the perfect church, and it's made of the perfect people, and it has the perfect leaders, the moment that you join it, it will now be an imperfect church because you recognize you are not perfect. You will have ruined it by your sheer attendance. And we think that, oh, if I find this place, I might make it imperfect, but it will turn me perfect. It will make me perfect. And we've got it backwards. We've got it backwards. When I was young and naive, somewhere around your age, I'm still naive, I'm just not young anymore. I had this idea. In my mind, I thought, I like photography. I'm going to start a photography business. And it took me forever to think of a name. I finally said in my mind, I like bokeh. That's going to be the title of my imaginary future company that's going to, going to really take off in terms of business. So I came up with, some creative logos for it. Now, I didn't bother doing any advertising. I didn't bother finding any clients. I didn't bother creating a website. In fact, I don't think I told anybody about it. I just created the logos and I thought, man, just the sheer beauty of this logo will draw people to me like a magnet. Now, surprise, surprise, I didn't have any clients and I didn't have any business. But that didn't deter me because a few years later I realized, you know what the problem was? The problem was that my logo wasn't spiffy enough. I need to update it to modern standards. So what I did is I came up with a better logo. And that one looked better, and I loved it. And it had the B and it had the P, and it's modern, it's geometric. In fact, the problem was not that I had one version or that I had 3 versions. I needed more versions. So I made a dozen. I made 18 versions, different colors and different shapes. And that was really going to boost my business. I had no business plan. I had a shoddy camera that I had in high school, but that was finally going to be the thing that brought my business up from the ground and would give me the recognition and the glory that I deserved. And it didn't work out. And it took me so much time to come up with the perfect logo, but the foundation of the business was never there. There was never anything undergirding that logo, anything supporting it, anything that it stood for. And you've not invested any time, or you've not invested enough time in your spiritual growth, and you think that by going and finding a church that will finally be the solution. It'll finally be the thing that brings your spiritual life up from the dead. And it'll make you a person who's living, yet you don't bother learning the fundamentals. You don't bother learning what's supposed to be there at the base. You might even have some esoteric knowledge about Christian dogma and whatnot, but you don't have that foundation. You don't have that spiritual discipline. And you're looking for the perfect church, the perfect little logo that'll represent who you are and what you stand for, but there's nothing there that's underlying it. And the reality is that God's love for you is shown by putting you in a place that's surrounded by imperfect people, that is an imperfect church. He shows you love through that. He shows you your idolatry by putting you in a place where He knows you'll see faults and you'll see problems, and that'll bug you. And He'll show you that all the things that you trusted in, the great worship leader or the preacher, maybe even the building itself, all of those things were things that you put faith in, but they don't give you anything back. The church is not God. The church is an entity that is created by God for our benefit, but it is not God itself. And like food and like relationships, all of those things can be corrupted. They can be usurped by Satan so that we trust in them, that we believe in them, that we pursue them instead of pursuing the ultimate joy, the ultimate one who can make all of these things good for us, God Himself. And then we become disappointed, thinking that God's not present in a place like that. And His Holy Spirit, it moves within us and it removes those things that destroy our joy, and it points them and it points to God, and it says, this is the thing that is the ultimate joy. The church might be perfect, the people might be perfect, but this is your ultimate joy. Pursue that. If you're looking for the perfect church, you'll just keep dancing from one place to another. You'll look for something good, and then you'll realize, hey, this is not so good, this is kind of bad. And you'll jump to the next place, and you'll jump to the next place, and you'll never get to that point where you're grinding deep. You're grinding against the imperfections that you have. You're grinding up against the imperfections that other people have, and you're making something where the relationship will be strong, where the relationship will be close. At this point, there is no closeness. There will be some discomfort, there will be some interaction, but there's no closeness. And combining a bunch of imperfect beings like yourself into a big room has never yielded anything that was perfect. So what are you entering into a church looking for? And it doesn't matter if everybody's imperfect in the same way as you. In fact, that might be even the worst thing to happen. It would be a terrible place to end up in a church where everybody is imperfect in the same way as you. Where their sins, where their troubles, where their lack of restraint or whatever is directed in the same place. Because you know what happens in a church like that? Nobody sees anybody's issues. Nobody sees anybody's problems. Everybody looks exactly like me. They're all perfect, just like I imagine myself to be. But a church is a place where not only are people different and sinful, they're sinful in different ways. And I can point to you and I can say, hey, I see this problem in your life. I see this trouble in your life. And you can speak to me and you can say, hey, I'm noticing this at fault with you. Let me hold you accountable to this, and you hold me accountable to that. And that is an imperfect church that's bringing us closer and closer to perfection. The worst church that you can find is one where everybody's blind to the same sin. Everybody sees themselves as being perfect in their own special way, and doesn't see where they need to grow. And we acknowledge that people come to Jesus in their imperfections. We acknowledge that when we came to Jesus, we were imperfect. Yet again, we have this idea that if all of these imperfect and broken people come together and we mash them together, somehow we'll make something perfect out of them. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't happen. Charles Spurgeon, in his sermon, The Best Donation, said, "You that are members of the church have not found it perfect, and I hope that you almost feel glad that you have not. If I had never joined a church till I had found one that was perfect, I should have never joined one at all. And the moment I did join it, if I had found it, I would have spoiled it, for it would have not been a perfect church after I had become a member of it. Still, imperfect as it is the dearest place to us. If we say it another way, it's good. Not only is it reality, it's good that there are no perfect churches. Because if we ever try to approach a perfect church, not only would we not join it without soiling it, without making it imperfect, we would be crushed by the weight of perfection that would exist in such a place. If you found a perfect church, you would be crushed by the perfection that existed in that place. You could not join it, and if you did, you would be destroyed by it. Because you know in your heart you're not perfect. And I want you to think about the grumblings and complainings that you have about, heck, even this church. Where are they coming from? Look for the evidence of grace that God gives you in that situation. To both recognize the faults that can be worked on, but also to recognize that you're grumbling within yourself. And look for things in your church that make it good, not things that make it perfect. Look for the good things, look good for the good traits that exist in the church that you are. And then make an honest assessment of how you are contributing to that frustration. How are you contributing with your grumblings? Where are those grumblings coming from? Are they coming from unrealistic expectations? Are they coming from sinful elitism? You know, we need to be somewhere up here. We're the Ivy League of churches. Or are you feeling that you've already arrived? You've achieved perfection for yourself. Now everybody else needs to catch up. And what I really feel like God does in those situations for us is He shows us that we still have issues with contentment. We still have issues with being happy with what we have. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul says this, "And He has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. I will boast about the things that are wrong with me, that Christ may be manifest through them. Therefore, I am well content with weakness and with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." He's writing to Corinthians and he's saying, in the weakness, in the places where there are problems, there is witness of Christ working in my life. And where is that need for you? Where is that need for you? When you see imperfections, what is that saying about you more than what that's saying about the church? Whenever I've had issues at home, and I feel like my wife is doing things that are not the way that I would do them. In the beginning, what I would do is I would look at her and I would say, what is she doing wrong? What is she not doing that's making my life miserable? What problems exist in her that are causing problems for me? And it took a long time for me to realize that the problems were really in me. The problems were never in her. The problems were not her doing something to me. It was me reacting to her. It was me expecting something of her. It was my brokenness that I was then not willing to accept, that I was casting on her, and I was surprised that she would react to it. And what I learned is that I'm the one that needs to grow in patience. I'm the one that needs to grow in understanding and long-suffering. I'm the problem here. And instead of looking for the cause of our problems, we look externally. We don't want to look inside. We don't want to admit that we're perfect, but we do not want to look inside. The cause can't be me. I am one person in a sea of people. In a sea of people in church, how can I be responsible for all of the problems that are surrounding me? And it's because they are your problems. Everybody else has their own problems, but yours are unique to you, and they're caused by you. And we think that mentoring or pastoring, counseling, all of those things will solve our problems. Something external will solve our problems. Now, those things are very good. And the more that we can have of it and the more people we can support who can do it, the better. But they are not going to solve your problem. You are grossly overestimating the power of a pastor's counseling abilities and talking abilities if you think that they're going to change something deep within you. You live with you every single day and you still can't change you. How do you expect another person to do it for you? How can you expect that a mentor, a counselor, or a pastor is going to fix what's wrong inside? That's your responsibility. They are good to have, but their lack is not the cause of our problems. They're good to have, but their lack is not the cause of our problems. So what does a perfect church actually look like? What does a perfect church actually look like? And when you say you're looking for a perfect church, here's what I think you're trying to articulate. Not perfection, but you're trying to articulate some kind of characteristics about this church. You want to see authenticity. A perfect church is authentic. That means people come to church and they talk about problems that they're having. They talk about issues within their life. If you want to see perfection, if you want to see a place where everything's perfect and shiny and perfectly filtered, you can open up Instagram. There's plenty of manicured lives there. Church is not about perfection in that sense. Perfection means authenticity. It means you come to a place where there is an open mic, where people can air their problems, where people can talk about what life really is like. That's perfection. That's perfection when people don't hide what's deep within them, but they talk about things that are deeper than that. And I'm grateful for those people who are authentic, even those people who might criticize me or other leaders, because you know what that says? That means that those people care about what's going on. And it keeps me on my guard, because I know I'm being watched. And if I'm being inauthentic, if I'm lying, if I'm talking about things that aren't true, they're going to call me out on it. A perfect church is full of peoples and naysayers who say the wrong things and who disturb properly orderly meetings and who make things a pain to live with. That is perfection. And some of the worst things that I've seen in church were caused by people who've fallen away. A perfect church shouldn't have anybody leave, technically. But we've seen people who've left due to sin, who've left due to their own neglect of their spiritual well-being. And when I saw these problems, it was a little bit sobering. But it also made me think, the problem must be in Jesus. He's the cause of this, right? He could have stopped those people from leaving. And then I realized that the people who left, the people who dropped out, the people that I don't see anymore, they were struggling with their faith. And instead of being angry at them, instead of being dismissive of them, what I learned is compassion. It aroused compassion in me. It made me more compassionate for the people who left, because I realized that they were suffering, that they were going through something that I wasn't going through, that I didn't have any context for necessarily. But that's perfection. Jesus called us, these were Jesus' words, be compassionate to one another. Look after those who are weak. Love your brother. A perfect church is where people leave and we go chasing after them and we find them and we bring them back and we say there's a better life here than out there. And we're compassionate to them. We're not indifferent. We're not saying this is our perfect church and it's good that people left. It's good that they left this place, so we're a little bit more perfect now than we were before they were here. A perfect church is compassionate. And in that same sermon that Charles Spurgeon preached, he said this, the church is faulty, but that is not your excuse for not joining it if you are the Lord's. Nor need your own faults keep you back, for the church is not an institution for perfect people, but a sanctuary for sinners saved by grace, who, though they are saved, are still sinners and need all the help they can derive from the sympathy and guidance of their fellow believers. Now, I don't want you to think I'm judging or somehow accusing people who have left or who've decided to go to another church. There's many different reasons why people leave. But I want to say that if you're leaving, if you're going somewhere else looking for perfection, you're not going to find it there. And realizing that we're not perfect does not preclude us from making our church more perfect. The fact that we realize that we're not perfect, the fact that we realize that we're sinful, does not stop us from making the church more perfect. The Constitution, it starts with the words, in order to form a more perfect union. They were realizing they're not going to form a perfect union, but this is as close as they're going to get, and they're going to continue working on it. They're going to continue getting better. And the same thing applies to a religious church, to a church that believes in God, as much as it applies to a nation that's ruled by laws. We can be made more perfect. A perfect church can be made more perfect. Ron Bailey made headlines in 2005. He was the first amateur racer who joined the Dakar Rally. Now, the Dakar Rally is the longest off-road race in the world. And Bailey, at 54, he had to talk his way into the race. He built his own custom-built $300,000 vehicle. And he lined up with 1,400 other competitors to drive 7,000 miles across the desert. And he was thinking he was entering a race. And the obstacles in this desert were sand, sandstorms. It was actually also bandits and landmines because they were driving through war zones. And just a few days into the race, they ran out of gas. And they were left with 1 day of supplies. They had 1 day of water and 1 day of food. And they survived on that for 5 days in the desert. It was only 5 days later that another vehicle was able to make it out to them to provide them with supplies so that they could continue on. But at that point, what had happened, the reason they had gotten lost is they missed a checkpoint. So they were already disqualified, but he still wanted to complete the race. So he continued on and he made it to the end. He made it to the finish line. He did not finish it technically because he was disqualified, but he made it to the end. And at the end, this is what he said. I know now that Dakar is not a race. It is a test of man's character. As the band's going to be coming up, I want you guys to think about this same thing for yourself. The perfect church is not about perfection. The perfect church is about us. What we think a church should look like says more about us than it says about this figment of our imagination that we are creating in our head. It speaks more to who we see ourselves as than it does to what kind of church we want to join. We all want to be in a perfect church. We all want to be in the best church that we possibly can. And chances are you're already in it. There are things that might come up that you'd say, well, you know, these are really problems. But that doesn't mean that you can bail. All that means is you've gotten close enough to rub deep and to rub hard. So I encourage you, find the perfect church, but realize that you're most likely already in it. Amen. Let's stand, and I'll give you a moment to pray to yourself, and then I'll finish as well. Father above, we come before you, Lord, with the understanding that you are the only one that's perfect, Lord. That whatever we set our eyes upon to replace you will ultimately disappoint us. Whatever we set our eyes upon to give us joy, to give us fulfillment, to bring us closer to you will fail because it is not you. And Lord, I ask for myself and for those around that as we look around and we see faults and we see problems in the people who lead and the people who attend, that it wouldn't discourage us. That it wouldn't discourage us from the church that we're in, that we wouldn't pass up a good church in pursuit of a perfect church which doesn't exist. Lord, bless us and bless our hearts so that we would desire to be with your people, that we would desire to make that which is the best that it can be here on earth more perfect, better, but that we would also realize that we're the ones who do it. And whatever shortcomings we see in the people around us, in the church around us, Lord, that ultimately they're a reflection of our own soul, our own shortcomings. And that each day we would try to make your body better, your church body better by being better ourselves, by growing closer to you, by growing more intimate with you. And that as we become closer and more like you, that the church that surrounds us would become more like you. Amen.